the reality on the ground seems to be shifting and moving ever more towards Russia. But even so, now, of course, I think that there's a military industrial complex involved here where, of course, it's profitable to pump weapons. But this conflict also seems to be existential in a lot of ways for the collective West. And we have to ask the question of, well, then what is next in this conflict, given that these weapons are not going to change the course on the battlefield? I know that we've all speculated, well, is there partition? I think even the collective West media, the corporate media, has even floated this idea of partition kind of ending the conflict. There's been some murmurs about peace talks with full Russian concessions or just a few Russian concessions. So there's been all this talk, but I guess it begs the question of what is next then, given that the battlefield seems to be an area that Ukraine is going to struggle in indefinitely.
Well, going back to the whole tank issue and what that author was doing, I mean, he's coming to this slow realization of the reality of all of this. And this is something the Western media is doing collectively. And I think these politicians, these policymakers who drummed up this proxy war, I've said many times before that what we're seeing in regards to Russia and China is the West just being out of time. They wanted to stop the reemergence of Russia and the rise of China, and they've failed. And in this proxy war specifically, you can see how unprepared they were versus Russia, who prepared specifically for this. The West, because they are pursuing global hegemony, they were stretched out thin. Their military was not configured for a large-scale, intense conflict like this. Russia specifically prepared for this. Their industry is specifically prepared for this. They have changed things on an institutional level to prepare for this that the West cannot and did not prepare. So where do they go next? It's a really hard question, because if the West were to back down, they constantly say if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, it's Ukraine ends, which is not true. It is not true. Ukraine is not going to end if they stop fighting. There will be negotiations and there will be some sort of settlement. And what is Ukraine? Because since 1991, a lot of what Ukraine has become is a construct of this Western meddling. So we keep talking about Ukraine sovereignty, and just as you said, especially with the coup in 2014, that sovereignty ended, and then they were eliminating opposition groups and media and banning, putting restrictions on the Russian language. So even if you hold an election in that environment, is that going to be a genuine, legitimate election? The answer is no. So where are they going with all of this? Their only alternative, if they cannot have what they want, they have to completely change their entire approach to foreign policy and just how the West exists with the rest of the world. I always kind of simplify it into saying they need to find a constructive role among the nations of the world rather than trying to impose themselves upon it. That's a very simplified version, but in reality, they have all of their institutions are all geared into imposing themselves onto the rest of the planet. And they would have to change all of that. Just think of the National Endowment for Democracy just by itself, and the subsidiaries and the adjacent organizations, USAID, the Soros Foundation. How many people is that alone? These are well-connected people. The people at the top are wealthy and influential. Are they going to give up? And the answer is no. They're not going to give up until it is impossible for them to continue doing this. And I think that's what Russia and China are trying to do. They're trying to create multipolarism. They're trying to create alternatives and a system, and kind of as gracefully as possible move past and away and onward without these people. And it's just going to be a process of whether or not in the West a different circle of interest can emerge and steer the country, or I would say countries, in the right direction to meet up with everybody else. Because if you are in the United States and then you go overseas, say to Asia, you could see how different society exists, and it's like day and night, and there's this divergence, and it's getting larger and larger each month, each year, I would say. The scary thing is, how far are they going to go to try to win this proxy war that is essentially unwinnable? Even if NATO intervenes directly, what do they think they're going to achieve? And then there's the whole China question. We're waiting to see what the Chinese government says. They're going to publicly announce their position on the conflict in Ukraine. And is it going to be continued semi-neutrality, or are they going to come down hard on Russia's side? And we don't know, but eventually China's going to have to make a decision regarding that. And just imagine if the U.S. cannot compare with Russian industrial output, what are they going to do in regards to China when it mobilizes its society?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the speech coming up. Xi Jinping has been announced that he will give a speech on the anniversary of the Russia's special military operation for this February 24th. There's also been a lot happening. Maybe we can now move into the global implications to all of this, because we had recently, over the last week, the Munich Security Conference, where you had heads of states and various officials, representatives of all these think tanks come together. The big theme, of course, was Ukraine, unsurprising. But you had, over this period, a lot of lecturing being done. So you had Antony Blinken, EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, Antony Blinken's Secretary of State, of course. And there was a cacophony of warnings to China saying, China, this is the red line. If you provide quote unquote lethal aid to Russia, then there will be consequences. That was really the big narrative coming out of the US and the EU. For China, the big conversation, of course, was, well, how can we achieve peace? How can we end this? And there were mentions of NATO's role. And of course, China has also released a flurry of reports from their perspective on what global security should be, as well as a huge report on the perils of US hegemony that's been circulating all across Chinese media. So what do you make of all of this? I mean, it feels like what you were just discussing, this divergence, is really intensifying between the US, the EU, the collective West on one side, Russia, China, and damn near almost everyone else on the other.
Well, first, let's address these so-called red lines that the West is laying out regards to China. China better not provide lethal aid to Russia or else. Just think about it, though. This is the same West that has crossed China's red lines. And as a matter of fact, their own red lines, because they all agreed to the one China policy with Beijing. And for people who don't know what that is, the West, every nation in the West, from the United States to the UK, the European Union, also nations like Australia, they all agreed with China, the People's Republic of China in Beijing, that there is only one China, that Taiwan is a part of it. There is no independent Taiwan. And yet, at the same time, after agreeing to that and agreeing to it for decades, as a matter of fact, they treat Taiwan as if it isn't some sort of independent entity, and they flood it with weapons. So especially the United States, they flood Taiwan with weapons to do exactly to China through Taiwan what they're doing to Russia through Ukraine. This is blatantly what they're obviously, without any debate, that is exactly what they're doing. And then they're going to lecture China about how you shouldn't help Russia. Let us kill Russia and then come for you next. And don't you try to intervene at any time in the process. Now, China's realistic about this. Obviously, they know that what is going on in Ukraine is directly related to their fate. If Russia is somehow eliminated, that is going to isolate China and allow the West to then pivot entirely over to China and focus all of their attention and resources on China. And so they know this. On the other hand, China is very serious about consistency in their foreign policy. If they say no intervention, they mean no intervention. If they say adhere to the international law, that's what they will do. So if they're going to announce anything in regards to assisting Russia, for in this conflict specifically, there will have to be some sort of way that fits into international law. And I'm not an international law expert. I don't know what angle they could use to do that. But I think that could kind of be a framework in trying to guess what China is going to say. I mean, we'll know soon enough as it is. But I think China, people say, why doesn't China help Russia? I mean, the China and India and many other countries not going along with the sanctions alone helps Russia in a huge, huge way.
Oh, indeed. And also the fact that, both China and Russia are permanent members of the Security Council. There's not much needed there. Either one of them can veto. And since this directly has to do with Russia, China generally can just abstain from whatever the U.S. and NATO the West brings to that forum. And, I mean, in my opinion, it feels like this ask for China, it's like, where would you like China to help? Because Russia seems to be doing okay on the military front. I mean, what would it take for China to show its solidarity with Russia? It seems like their partnership is all that Russia has asked for, because publicly and privately, we've seen that Russia has respected China's position, and there really hasn't been too many ruffles there. But I'm wondering what your opinion is about that, because I think that is an interesting. I think a lot of people, especially who follow us, they want to see an end to this thing and feel like any kind of support that Russia can get can do it. But I just, I'm wondering if you have any other further thoughts on that.
Well, one thing that I guess China could definitely help out with is also in regards to the sanctions. If there are components that Russia needs for different types of weapon systems, those subcomponents could be made available by China, circumventing these sanctions. That would be really important. And there's a lot of ways for Russia to do that without even involving the Chinese government itself. So that's one guess. A lot of the things that we could possibly imagine, if they have artillery munitions, if somehow Russia was running low on that for some reason, maybe something like that. But in terms of ramping up military industrial output, just like it's going to take the U.S. a long time to ramp that up, or we see Russia in the middle of doing it, and they have been for years, and we see the results of that. It would also take China a while to ramp up on their end, if that is something they decide to help Russia with. But let's say they did that, I think that would put an end to it, because this is clearly a war of attrition. And if on the Russian side, Russia's already formidable industrial output combines with China's, then it's a done deal. There's no way the U.S. will ever be able to compete on the same level. A lot of people are talking about these chips, chip production, semiconductors. A lot of the chips that military gear use, they're usually larger. They're not these tiny, super sophisticated chips that we have in our devices and everything. They're specific for a very narrow, focused use, and it's an entirely different type of hardware. So that's something else people should keep in mind. A lot of what we hear coming out of the West is incoherent, because a lot of the people running the West have no idea how anything in reality works. They are people who are involved in law and politics and propaganda, and they are detached from things like industry, manufacturing, and the art of war.
Yeah, and during the Deng Xiaoping era in China, something that Deng Xiaoping used to say and was adopted by much of China's government, the Communist Party of China, was hide your strength and bide your time. And I think that is something to consider. I'm wondering your thoughts, Brian, because we say it a lot. It's like time is on the side of Russia. Time is on the side of China. It's not on the side of the collective West. and by China carefully navigating this conflict. And I think Russia as well. I think both Russia's directly involved. Russia had to launch a special military operation, but both of them have also been very careful in navigating this conflict, ensuring that it doesn't get out of hand for them, balancing all of the various interests that need to be paid attention to. And it just feels like that slogan, that kind of phrase, I really does encapsulate, I think, what the difference is between China, Russia, and the collective West.
Yeah, absolutely. We can see Russia not just in this current proxy war, but also America's proxy war against Syria and Russia's intervention there. They're extremely patient, and they think far into the future, and they ignore temporary, short-term political setbacks, no matter how humiliating, no matter what the temporary cost is in the short term. Ultimately, all they're focused on is long-term success. We saw that all throughout their intervention in Syria, and I always go back to the example of Turkey shooting down one of their warplanes and ambushing the rescue crew, and maybe not Turkey, but militants that they were backing, ambushing the rescue crew, and everyone at the time was livid. They were so angry. They wanted revenge immediately. And Russia didn't do anything, really. I mean, not what you would have expected them to do. And that paid off because they were thinking the best revenge is ultimately succeeding. That is the best revenge of all. And also, it's the best way to make use of the sacrifices of people involved on the ground. I mean, what did they die for? So you could get petty revenge, or so that you could achieve the objectives that they were there fighting for in the first place. And so you see that all throughout that conflict, and we see that now in the proxy war the U.S. is waging against Russia and Ukraine. We see how patient they are. When they withdrew their troops from Kharkov and Ukrainian forces moved in, when they withdrew from Kherson city to the east bank of the Dnieper River, the Western media had a field day with that. And remember all of the celebrations and how happy everybody was supporting Ukraine. But they're thinking long term, and you can see how that's paying off for them. They preserved their fighting capacity. They still have their fighting capacity. Ukraine expended theirs. Now they're having a crisis in terms of arms and ammunition and trained manpower. And that is the difference between someone thinking long term, playing a game of chess, and someone who's kind of just reacting to things in the moment, like a game of dodgeball. And we see two entirely different approaches and outcomes based on the way they've decided to go about doing this.